So first of all, this is a collaborative project with Sabine Topf, who is at the psychology department at University College. I'm at City University, and Sandra Koo was one of my students who helped me and Sabine carry out this study. So the research is very applied. It's a study of exactly the factors that influence a real appeal, and I will try and make that clear as we go, exactly how we did what we did. Obviously there'll be questions at the end, but I hope the actual nature of what we did and how we did it will be easy to understand as we go. So what we looked at is a study. We looked at an existing weekly appeal that's carried out on the BBC. That's the main broadcaster in the United Kingdom, and we took advantage of the fact that they have a weekly appeal on the radio where they broadcast a different charitable appeal each week, and it's only for a couple of 2 or 3 minutes, and somebody presents the appeal, usually perhaps a celebrity or somebody that often the audience would at least recognize, even if they wouldn't call themselves a celebrity. And as I say, the appeal varies each week, so it's not for the same charity. And we could identify a large set of these appeals to study aspects of the appeals which varied across them. Now, as I imagine many people will know, there are some generic factors in charitable appeals which have been associated with their efficacy. So, for example, mention of a single identifiable victim of a problem that the charity seeks to address has been identified as a pertinent factor that will change the efficacy of the appeal. Also, such things as how much of the money that's collected actually goes to the cause. And there are other things which perhaps are less well known about the characteristics of presenters, people actually voicing the appeal or fronting the appeal if it's on some visual medium. And I will quickly go through some of these factors just to sort of review them, and so that we sort of know where we are with respect to what we would expect these factors to do. And indeed, this was the sort of initial focus, at any rate, of what our study attempted to find out. So there's some information about the BBC appeal, and you can see it's been going on actually for many years, well before the 2009 date that we have there, but the window of appeals that we have studied is in that period. We've got information essentially about how much money was raised by each appeal. So briefly, the appeal is broadcast on a Sunday morning and also on a Sunday afternoon. It's repeated, and it's also broadcast on a Thursday evening. So it goes out on 3 different occasions. It's usually, as I say, a celebrity presenter, and we managed to study over 350 of these appeals. We got the information about essentially how much money each of 358 appeals raised, and we were able to sort of look at the content of each appeal, the verbal narrative, to establish what factors were present in those appeals, so we could look at the association between those factors and the amount of money. So the logic is actually pretty simple. So here's some information about identifiable victims. This is probably very familiar to many of you, that bringing information about a particular person has been associated in the literature with an increase in willingness to donate. And various people have looked at this. It's become a little sort of industry in itself. However, more recent papers are suggesting that the effects of this variable may have been sort of somewhat overestimated, and as we will see, some people have even argued that it's been misidentified, and that in fact what's responsible for the effect of identifiable victims may be a different factor, which is often confounded with the identifiable victim. So there is evidence more recently, and this is what we will be looking at more closely, that the impact of a donation, like what actual benefits will accrue from money that I might plausibly donate as an individual. What could my money deliver? So one of the problems, of course, is that people can often feel overwhelmed by some causes, because the problem seems so immense that the value of an individual's donation just seems very insignificant, and it can very easily make people feel overwhelmed and basically that they will have no effect. Again, you know, there's whoops, I beg your pardon. There's evidence about how to address that issue in a number of sort of laboratory studies, and indeed a recent claim that there is greater efficacy of a tangible impact when it's applied to a single victim. Here's a snapshot of some of the people that actually were the presenters of the appeals that we studied. You may not recognize all of them. I'm not sure I could tell you who they all are, but some of them are familiar to me, and it gives you an idea that you know, film actors are very popular selections for this slot. So people identifying the charities looking for someone to present are obviously focusing on celebrity as a means to increase donations. And indeed, there is evidence in the literature that supports that idea, and also that particular traits of these celebrities can be useful. So not every famous person, of course, is necessarily particularly admirable. I'll leave you to think of your examples of that. But you know, it's worth bearing in mind that particular individuals may be better or worse for your particular charity than others. There is also evidence that gender has an effect. So there are various studies that we found in the literature looking for these effects, which suggest that there are differences between male and females. Females might be seen as warmer, but male presenters are often associated with higher ratings of credibility and expertise, and indeed self-confidence. And that may well have an effect. There's also the possibility of self-interest. So some of the people that front these broadcasts are associated with the cause that they are appealing for. So they may have even been directly affected themselves, for example, by a particular illness, or they may refer to a partner or a close relative who was affected by the illness. So they speak with some, you know, not an independent voice necessarily. And these are some examples that might suggest that that would have some positive benefit. So these are cases of people that actually died during attempts to fundraise for charity by running marathons or doing a channel swim, and their deaths triggered large donations to those causes, suggesting that that might have an impact on the public. Because it's radio, the medium we're looking at, we also looked at how the physical or acoustic properties of voices might have an effect. Again, there is some evidence that lower pitched voices are viewed more favorably. Of course, males have lower pitched voices than females in general, and indeed there is some studies suggesting that females with lower pitched voices do better. So there's an overview of the radio appeal. As I said, it's 2 to 3 minutes. It's broadcast on 3 separate occasions during a week. The cumulative weekly audience is about 2 million people. Because of the nature of the channel, it tends to be a rather elderly audience. So 70% of the audience to this channel is, and indeed to the slots that this item is broadcast in, is over 55. And there's a slight bias towards females. So here's the sort of structure for those that are interested. There were 529 appeals in the total period that we got data for. but we had to exclude various of the appeals because information that we needed to carry out our study wasn't available for all of them. So we end up with 358 appeals, which, you know, I'm quite pleased with, because I think that's a pretty large number to sort of study statistically. So we've got the amounts raised per appeal, we've got the audience figures, we've got a rating as well for these broadcasts. So there's a panel that rates how interesting and or enjoyable radio programs are. And we have other data as well about these charities more generally from the Charity Commission. We know what their incomes are, but we know particularly for our study how much was raised in each of these for these appeals through that medium. So there's a particular channel that the donations come to, so the charity knows exactly how much money came as a result of that broadcast. So that's what we coded up. We've got various features in the broadcast that we coded, so we know what their gender is, we know what their celebrity status is. We basically, for that, used the size of their Wikipedia page, which sounds a bit peculiar, but that has been used in a number of studies to measure the scale of celebrity, and it has served as a useful sort of proxy measure of celebrity, so we use that. We also coded up whether the presenter had a self-interest or not, are themselves or a close other implicated in the cause that's being appealed for. Do they have relevant expertise? So sometimes you have doctors who know about some medical condition, or you have lawyers who know about some legal issue. We also know whether there was a single identified victim, and we know whether or not specific donation amounts were suggested. That was another feature we looked for. Sometimes they suggest an amount or even more than one amount. And also whether the donation, when they mention it, would solve a specific problem. And it's not just like, oh, you could help people. A particular feature is being identified that could be solved. So here's a couple of examples. Okay, so here's two ways in which tangible impact could be produced from a donation which is within the scope of an individual. You know, so £25 isn't a huge sum of money. You know, it's a significant sum for people to give up. It's not like, you know, giving money, throwing a coin at someone on the street, but it's still within the realms of possibility for many of the people in this audience. So here's some data about the donations. So on average, the donations that were made to this weekly appeal, it's nearly £16,000. It has a large variation, however. And the incomes of the charities, well, they on average get about 9 million a year, these charities. Again, there's a range to that. And you can see the audience ratings for this slot are pretty positive. So on a 0 to 100 scale, the mean is about 70. So it's not a big turnoff as you might suspect it might be. The presenters of the program, those are the data on their features. So about half claim to have some sort of experience or expertise that's relevant. About a third think, you know, we coded as having a sort of self-interest. The celebrity status, probably hard to get a feel for that, but there's a range of celebrity, and you know, we have a good measure of that certainly a good range of that across the sample. Voice pitch, again, that probably means very little to you, but that's the mean hertz of their voice. And the presenters about 50% female. It's exactly 50% in the broadcast, but as I said, we had to drop some out, so we ended up with slightly more female presenters than male. And there's the content. So it's quite common now for charities to have a single identifiable victim. It's also quite common for them to suggest a donation amount. Less common is having a specific problem that can be addressed by a donation amount. You can see about 25%. The median amount given by a donor was about £20. That's not from this broadcast, by the way, but that's data from the charity the data that I mentioned that we collected other information from. So what factors predict donations? We put all these factors into a regression model. So as I said, we have 358 broadcasts. That's quite a large set. And so we have quite a bit of power here statistically to identify the impact of different factors. And we can see that well, perhaps more interestingly straight away is the things which didn't matter. So the celebrity of the presenter, we have no measurable impact of that at all. So any efforts made by the charity to get a celebrity to deliver don't seem to be paying off. The pitch of voice didn't matter. But what did matter, gender and the tangible impact. So males delivered more money than females as presenters, and the tangible impact produced a measurable benefit in terms of donations. So why did male presenters raise more money? Well, hard to know. The pitch of their voices is different, but as I said, pitch of voice didn't really have any effect overall, so I don't think it's attributable to that very plausibly. Self-interest, well, there was a difference there, which I'll come back to shortly. So males and females were differentially associated with self-interest, so you can see that here. Oh, that's the voice pitch. So there you go. Surprise, surprise, the females had higher pitched voices than the males. Self-interest was more commonly associated with the female presenters in our sample. That doesn't mean that they raised more money, of course, but there just were more of them. So that in itself might have been one reason why females did less well, and I'll come back to why that is. So appeals raised more money when they had tangible impact. There's a histogram plot. Obviously, there were more appeals with no impact than with tangible impact, and those two distributions show you the scale of it. So it's not a vast effect, but there is a measurable influence there, as you can see. And here we have evidence of an interaction. Tangible impact had a benefit, but not when it was associated with self-interest by the presenter. So you can see on the left-hand side there, those two blocks suggest that when there's no tangible impact mentioned, self-interest didn't really make any difference, not a measurable one anyway, but it did make a difference when there was tangible impact. The absence of self-interest, you get a lot better performance with tangible impact in terms of donations, which is on the vertical axis there. So you can see the magnitude of it is quite sizable compared to when there is self-interest. So the absence of self-interest seems to be a positive thing. There was no similar dampening effect on donations as a function of the presenter's personal experience. So had they, witnessed things without necessarily being a beneficiary of what the charity is raising for, that didn't seem to have any influence that we could measure at all. So it didn't cost anything either in terms of the benefits of tangible impact, but it didn't give you any extra. I hope I finished on time, but there's a summary of what we found. We've got real donation data, and I emphasize the value of that because, as you may know, many of the laboratory studies that study these things are forced to rely on either hypothetical responses where you ask people, would they give money, or you endow them with a small amount of money, often as a gift for participation, and ask whether they would like to donate some of that money to the charity that you're referring to. And of course, that might be an easier thing to do and might respond differentially to the kind of factors that we've looked at. In our case, we're actually measuring, what factors really influence real people who don't understand that they are actually participants in a study. So, this is all something which is done after the fact without any self-consciousness about your response in relation to some researchers' questions. We've also done lots of things I hadn't have time to tell you about, but we've controlled for sort of obvious things like inflation over the period, and we also looked at consumer confidence, which fluctuated quite markedly during the period. That didn't seem to have any effect, as it does on sales of consumer goods, for example. So I think that's all. I think that's my last slide. Oh, no, it's not. There's a little bit of information about what makes a good charitable appeal. It just rehearses what I've said. A male presenter, a tangible impact of no self-interest. So, questions?
Right, thank you, Peter. And we can hear the Big Ben, some of the attendees are saying. It creates a great atmosphere. Nick, do we have any questions from
Sure.
audience?
First question is, would you expect similar results were you to conduct this study on direct response television appeals? And generally speaking, how generalizable to other media do you think these results are?
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously we're trapped in the medium that we've studied. So the obvious answer I have to give to that question is I don't really know. But the fact that, you know, we have been able to measure something about tangible impact, I would be very surprised if that conclusion varied as a function of television. There may be a difference if you did this on TV in relation to the sort of visual characteristics of the presenter. And as I think you're going to hear later anyway, about the use of visuals and pictures and so on, which obviously isn't an option on the radio. So that may be an extra factor that you can experiment with, but may also potentially crowd out some of the things that you get from the radio, where obviously the focus is on the narrative and people are listening. If they are, then you've got them trapped in relation to the narrative that you present. TV, perhaps the attention is a little more diffuse, but obviously there's scope for other things. But I would be surprised if tangible impact didn't replicate across different media.
And then a similar question, do you think that these results would be similar in the United States?
I've got no reason to doubt it, but of course, you know, there are cultural differences in attitudes to various things in the United States. So I could imagine that there may be some sort of differences that are kind of culturally motivated. Again, it's hard to see why tangible impact would not be a positive feature, if not more positive, possibly. There may be other considerations, again, which might be different in the US, but again, I find it hard to imagine that tangible impact would not be manifest.
Excellent. Another question on gender. Did you find any evidence of people giving to a presenter of either a similar or different gender more often? That is, did the presenter split and the donor split have anything to do with each other?
Okay, so we don't have any data. We don't have any data on the givers other than aggregate data, which the BBC gave us about what the typical audience for that program is. So we don't know about the individual donations. I couldn't tell you even how many there were. So for example, if an appeal raised, you know, £20,000, for all we know, that could have come from one check by one donor. That would be astonishing, of course, but we just don't have that information. One thing which I think I did mention in the presentation, which probably ought to be sort of flagged up as a caveat, is that the audience for this broadcast is slightly biased to being female. And that might be one reason why male presenters did somewhat better than female presenters. So, you know, had we had an audience that was more evenly balanced with respect to gender, that might, you know, have told us a slightly different story. So we don't have information about the individual donations, so it's not possible for us to sort of address that question with these data.
That makes perfect sense. You mentioned the audience tended to be older women. What impact do you think that had on results?
Again, I could only speculate about that, but I mean, the Radio 4 audience is, you know, stereotypically sort of a middle class audience. That's the sort of general stereotype of it. That you don't want to put too much weight on that, because actually, you know, people across the whole demographic range are listeners to that broadcast. But the slots when the broadcast goes out slightly add to that. So, you know, Sunday mornings, probably not peak time for younger people to be listening to the radio, or for families to be listening to the radio, I imagine. So I really don't know. It's sort of difficult to sort of guess what those things are. But again, I would apply a sort of general caveat to the nature of the slot, and, you know, our findings obviously are limited to what we can study with that slot. But again, I would emphasize that some of the findings that we have are hard to attribute to the constraints of the slot.
Excellent, thank you. Were there a wide variety of charitable organizations tested across arts, health, social, disease, all of those sorts of sector? And did you see any sector differences?
We did look for that, and we couldn't find any evidence for it. So, for example, we looked whether people are more likely to give to a UK-based charity, you know, charity begins at home kind of thing, versus an overseas cause. We couldn't find any effect of that. Are people more likely to give to children than to adults? Are they more likely to give or less likely to give to animals rather than humans? And we couldn't find any evidence for that. But of course, once we break down even our large sample of 358 charities, they were a wide range in answer to the sort of first part of the question. So the numbers that we have within each of those sectors that we could identify start to get a little bit small. But nonetheless, we couldn't find evidence of the nature of the charity in generic terms being anything that we could identify as helping us to predict how much money would be donated.
Thank you. Was there any impact on the age of the celebrity presenter? You looked at male, female there. Would you recommend that if you were choosing a presenter, they'd be in the same age as the typical donor, or does it matter?
We didn't actually even attempt to measure that. I guess that's something that we could do. I think by and large, the typical presenter here tends to be, let's put it kindly, middle-aged and above. So it's not, I don't think we have many people who are very young as presenters. There may be one or two sort of pop stars or something like that, but by and large, these are a fairly homogenous group of people. So I couldn't really say about that.
So the celebrities may be selected just like the donors were.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question that, you know, I think what I would say to charities is that, you know, the lack of a celebrity isn't going to harm you, according to what we've found at any rate. I mean, of course, different media may be different. So people may, you know, watch, you know, they may just attend more to a celebrity on TV. I mean, some of our voices are quite familiar voices, you know, like, I don't know, people like Stephen Fry and Michael Palin are very well-known voices, especially on Radio 4, which is the channel which these things went out on. So that probably gives you something in terms of, you know, number of listeners who are willing just to sort of prick their ears up when they hear the voice. Again, we didn't find any effect of celebrity, and there was quite a lot of variance in that. So it's not clear that that really has an effect. On TV, in other media, I think that remains to be established. And I would just add that on the BBC, there's a lot of charitable, they have a whole annual thing on TV charities and other things as well, when the celebrities are actually engaged in a form of entertainment. This appeal is a 2 or 3 minute, very prosaic narrative. There's no attempt to entertain, particularly in the way the broadcast goes out. On TV, of course, it's a different medium, often with the BBC appeals that go out, and I'm sure many others, you know, there may be a song, a sketch, a joke, or something like that, which is combined with the appeal.
Thank you. And one last question. Looking at outside factors included in the variable, did you look at weather, big news story, seasonality, any of those sorts of things?
We did look at seasonality. So as you could see, we've got, you know, something 9 or 10 years of data, and we look to see whether people give more, you know, in the winter than the summer and so on. We couldn't find any evidence for that, barring Christmas. So there is, you might not be too surprised to hear, they often do on this broadcast a different sort of broadcast which acknowledges Christmas. And we could find increased donations in the run-up to Christmas. But whether that was due to the seasonality per se, or the self-conscious acknowledgement that, you know, this was about Christmas, or to sort of help people have a better Christmas than they might otherwise, it's hard for us to know.